at a fast review of part one. So Job is kind of like, as I've been told, like The Hobbit to the Lord of the Rings. It's the prequel. It's the prequel to the Bible. It's written before Genesis, even though the events it tells happened probably around the time of Jacob's life. The book of Job tells you why you need a Bible, or to put it another way, why you need revelation from God to know what's happening. And essentially what you have is, you have a book that has two trials. Trial one is a trial in heaven between God. God puts himself on trial, essentially, and he summons Satan, and he presents Job as a possibility, and Satan takes the bait, and he tries to get Job to fall and curse God. And yet, round one, Job doesn't. He worships. Round two, Job doesn't, and he doesn't sin against God. So chapters 1 and 2, the trial in heaven is done. God is shown to be right. And so a big theme in the book is the rightness of God, or the righteousness of God. In fact, the word righteousness, or some form of it, is used more in Job than in any other book of the Bible, even Romans, which is what we think of the righteousness book. So it's the rightness of God. And the second courtroom scene, the second trial is on earth. And that's between Job and his friends of, is God right? So Job in chapter 3 laments the day of his birth. He's asking the question, why is this happening? And then chapter 4 begins the first set of 3 cycles. And he has 3 friends that come to him, and each friend represents a different style of arguing, and each cycle represents a different kind of approach, epistemologically or philosophically. So Eliphaz seems to be geared more towards like a view of history. So like, oh, this is how the past was. In the past, it's always been this way, that, if you sinned, you suffered. And they're kind of operating on this principle that, essentially if you reap what you sow, but a simplified version. So what they're doing is they're just essentially taking a piece of what is true in life, and they're expanding it out to say like, this covers everything. And they're not recognizing that, no, that is in the right context, a true thing, but not across the board. And so Eliphaz focuses on history primarily. They all kind of appeal to history in some regard, but he really focuses on it. Bildad focuses on science and observation. He'll say, like, look at the papyrus, and he used that as an example. And then you have Zophar, who seems to be more like a philosopher, theologian. And so round one, one of them will speak, Job responds. One speaks, Job responds. One speaks, Job responds. And in round one, they come at it from, and of course we're putting modern terms on this, like Clayton said, but from like a pre-modern period. They're claiming knowledge in heaven and on earth. They know what's happening in heaven. They know what's happening on earth. And Job's like, how do you know that? You don't know that. And Eliphaz will even have this section where he's like, well, I had this dream. Or I had this, well, he doesn't say a dream, but he had this experience. And it was like some force came. Hey, come on in.
Start now.
And we're just doing, we can start now. And we're doing Job recap. Were you here last time for Job part 1?
No.
Okay.
One, so why don't you just go ahead and go over that?
Yeah, we'll do it again. So you'll pick it up, yeah. So we're in the recap section. So Job is the prequel to the Bible. It's like The Hobbit to the Lord of the Rings. It tells us why we need the Bible. It's about God's righteousness and how God is right. And you have the trial in heaven, chapters 1 and 2, Job, God and Satan, and then the trial on earth with Job and his friends. The 3 friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar. Eliphaz is kind of like a historian. Bildad is like a scientist focused, empiricism, and then Zophar is like a philosopher, theologian. They have 3 rounds, and each round has a different focus. The first round is pre-modern. They're claiming knowledge in heaven and on earth. And Job questions them. He says, how do you know that? How do you know what's happening in heaven? How do you know it's happening in these ways, that it's this way? And so I was just saying, Eliphaz has this statement where he's like, well, I had this experience, and this spirit was there, and he claims like divine knowledge based on his experience. And so Job is just questioning that. So by the first time, as each gets a turn to talk to Job, then they each respond, or Job responds to each one of them, and in the process they're they're left to abandon that first style. So round 2 happens, and what you have is essentially a more modern perspective. And they're no longer claiming as much knowledge in heaven as much as they are just what they can observe on the earth. And so they come at him again, and Job responds each time. And he's questioning their ability to do that. And then round 3 comes, and it's more of a postmodern, because they're not even rationally reasoning with Job anymore. At this point, they're just like, Job, you sinned. You did this and you did, and they're actually claiming he did sinful things that they're just kind of making up. It's like, in my mind, you did this, right? So that's kind of their perspective, and they've kind of lost all tether to reality. And so that is how the 3 phases of the debates with Job's friends go. They move from that pre-modern to a modern. And what you're seeing is these guys are really smart. They're like PhDs. They're not dummies. They know the world really well. And you could say that they're like experts in their fields of, the fields of history, the fields of science, and the fields of philosophy and theology. And they're also trying to work out what's happening to Job based upon worldly philosophies of a pre-modern, a modern, and a postmodern perspective. And with all the 3 of those disciplines and all 3 of those empirical methods, they can't do it. Nobody suggests that God brought Satan into heaven and said, have you considered my servant Job to show that I'm right? And no one suggested that because no one could know that. And so after the 3rd round, Job basically goes on this incredibly long response, longer than any of his other responses. And in the midst of that, he gets to chapter 28. And he gets to chapter 28, and he essentially says this: man is very skilled at finding stuff in the earth. Man has plumbed the depths and found precious jewels and metals in the earth. They've dug down deep. He says in verse 1, surely there's a mine for silver, a place for gold that they refine. Iron is taken out of the earth, and copper is smelted from the ore. And so man puts an end to darkness and searches out the farthest limit. The ore in gloom and deep darkness. He opens shafts in a valley away from where anyone lives. They are forgotten by travelers. They hang in the air. It's like an old school elevator. Far away from mankind, they swing to and fro. And so basically, you see Job saying, man has been able, and just appreciate how long ago this was. I mean, Job he's like the patriarchal period, and he's saying how much ingenuity there was in mankind to dig out things from the earth. But then he gets to this point, in verse 12, and he says, but where shall wisdom be found? And where is the place of understanding? Man does not know its worth, and it is not found in the land of the living. He'll say, verse 18. Verse 14. The deep says, it is not in me. The sea says, it is not with me. So he's saying, you can't go to some part of the earth and find wisdom. It cannot be bought for gold, and silver cannot be weighed as its price. It cannot be valued in the value of offer, in precious onyx or sapphire. Gold and glass cannot equal it, nor can it be exchanged for jewels of fine gold. No mention shall be made of coral or of crystal. The price of wisdom is beyond pearls. The topaz of Ethiopia cannot equal it, nor can it be valued in pure gold. From where then does wisdom come, and where is the place of understanding? It is hidden from the eyes of all living and concealed from the birds of the air. Abaddon and Death say, we have heard a rumor of it with our ears. God understands the way to it. He knows its place. And then he ends the chapter in verse 28, and he says, and he said to man, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to turn away from evil is understanding. And really, that's the statement Solomon makes, but Solomon didn't say it first. Job said it first. And essentially, the argument is, you cannot know what is really happening in the world unless God tells you. You are dependent on God opening his mouth and revealing himself to you. That's why we say the book of Job tells you why you need a Bible. Because there's suffering in the world, things happen, and we ask the question, why? Why is the world like this? Why is there suffering like this? Why am I suffering? Why are they suffering? And people have all kinds of ways to think about it. They look to history, they look to science, they look to philosophy and theology, and they look to different methods of how we know what we know, for sure. And yet no one can have certainty, epistemological certainty, as to why what is happening unless God opens his mouth. And that's what Job's basically thesis comes to. Of course, Job is trying to figure this out as well, and he's trying to wrestle with this. He doesn't quite get it all, but he knows that if man is to really know, God has to reveal himself and open his mouth. Here's the other really important thing about this first half of the book. And do you guys remember what it was for you two who were here? Job's, he has more than three, but we called him three wishes, right? Or someone has called them wishes. But really, there are these three longings that Job has. And it's really starts in that first round. And he essentially says, man, I know God would be right. Essentially, if God could just forgive my sins, I would just have so much assurance in my suffering. If God could just forgive me of my sins. And then he'll have another wish a little bit later. And he'll say, if only there was like a mediator, someone who could, and he's just kind of like, he's like spitballing, we might say, like, man, if only there was someone who was like God, who could put their hand on God. But who could put their hand on God? This is my paraphrase, because he's God. You can't just walk into God's throne room and be equals with God. But also they would have to be man. And so he's just kind of like hoping, wondering. And then he says, if only there could be a resurrection, that I could see God and know that my flesh would be brought back to life. And so Job hopes for the gospel. I mean, he hopes for a God-man mediator who will raise the dead, who will forgive sin and raise the dead. That's his longing in his suffering. Now, he needs more revelation for that. But Job understands as well, because in the beginning of the book, he's sacrificing for his kids. So he understands he's a believer, but he just doesn't have all the revelation that the rest of the Bible will give. Here's some of our outline. And I told you before, I borrowed this outline because it's so helpfully alliterated from a website that I found. And so this is kind of what we were using because it's just helpful to package it. So I'm going to review what we've covered and what we covered last time, and then we'll make some new ground going from there. So the chapters 1 to 3, we called unexpected calamity. Unexpected calamity. So you have the trial in heaven, essentially. And then you have unhelpful counsel. And this is round 1. It's chapter 4 to 14. Unhelpful counsel. Then in 15 to 21, unwarranted criticism. So if they start out with just like bad counsel, sometimes they'll say things that sound somewhat good, but they're applying it wrongly. Like it's like if sometimes there's a lot of ways this can happen. You can shop for advice, right? And you're looking, so you talk to like 5 people, but you only tell people just enough, like maybe to favor your thing. And they tell you information, counsel based on what you told them, but you didn't give them the whole picture. So they may not give good advice because you didn't tell them everything. Or it could just be that, we just don't know all the factors that we need to in order to give good counsel. Well, they are giving counsel to Job, and they don't have a full deck, so to speak. And so they're reasoning according to their own minds. So it's unhelpful. They have unwarranted criticism in 15 to 21 because they start charging Job with doing wrong. And they increase in their intensity. And yet, Job hasn't suffered because he sinned. And the book begins very clearly identifying that Job is righteous. Then you have ungodly condemnation in chapters 22 to 26. And that's really where they get postmodern. And they're like, Job, and they just start making stuff up about what Job did. And they get really forceful. And then finally, Job has this really long response in chapters 27 to 31. And this was called Unsettled Conundrum from Job. Job is just unsettled. He can't figure this out. Why is this happening? He's lamenting his counselors. One of the chapters, it's like before, and the next chapter is after. Yeah, chapter 29 is Job before. And he's like, man, this is what my life was like before all this happened to me. And then chapter 30, Job after. And Job's thinking, man, but now. And he talks about like the respect he had before the town. Young people would respect him, but now in his condition, he gets no respect. Can't get no respect. It's like Rodney Dangerfield. So that's where we end that's where we ended last time. We ended in chapter 31, and Job is just making kind of a final appeal, and that's where we left. So let me just stop there. That was a lot to to catch up. But any thoughts about that? Clarifications about that?
I have one question.
Yeah.
I'll go back to Benny. So, I guess in a pre-Old Testament, in the Old Testament perspective, when it says, when God calls Job, have you considered my servant Job? For there is no one like him on earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil.
Mm-hmm.
How do we? I guess what? How do we square that with our? I guess the total depravity.
Yeah, that's a great question. The Old Testament seems to use the term blameless, not in the sense that he's never sinned before,
Right.
but like his sins are confessed. He's a godly, righteous individual.
So similar to how he's arguing with his friends, he knows he's not perfect.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
he's not being. This didn't happen to him because he's got some unconfessed sin.
Sure. Yeah, and so like when Job will say, in whatever, I think it's in chapter 9, where he longs for forgiveness.
When you say that's what.
It's not that he's saying, yeah, you guys are right, I did sin, and I've just been hiding it. That's really key, actually, in the book, that the book really goes out of its way to establish Job does not suffer because he sinned, because that's their argument. They're essentially saying, you had to have done something wrong, Job. That's why you're suffering. And he's like, no, I don't think so. There's nothing in my life. I mean, I haven't done anything wrong. And he doesn't mean I've never sinned. He means I haven't consciously done anything against God. And you'll see, he's offering sacrifice for his sons and for himself. And so he keeps a very close or very short time between sinning and confessing, right? I think that's a good way to put it. So that's what he means by blameless and upright and turning away from evil. So he's a sinner. He knows that. He knows he needs a redeemer. He needs forgiveness of sins, resurrection. But he knows he's not suffering because of his sin. However, later in the book, towards the end, he gets so exacerbated by all this, and maybe caused by his friends a little bit, that he does sin in the midst of his suffering, right? But that's not... So this is helpful, because at the end of the book, he'll say, I repent, right? What is he repenting of? I think it would be a misstep to say he's repenting of, like, the friends are like, oh, we got you. You did sin. That's not right, because God rebukes the friends. And so they were wrong in God's eyes. But Job is repenting of sinning in the midst of his suffering, starting to charge God with wrong, starting to question God's rightness in his situation. Even though Job doesn't know why he's suffering, why God is bringing this into his life, he starts to get frustrated at God. He crosses the line, right? There's a legitimacy to lament, I think in chapter 3, where he's able to just bring forth. But later he starts to really just become a little self-righteous. Is that helpful?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yeah. And I guess the other just thought I had is we're blessed where we are today is we have God's revealed word. But these guys are trying to give counsel and argue with. I mean, what are they drawing on?
Yeah. So I think that you have clearly there's some revelation given, because Adam and Eve knew. God's directly spoke to them, but then even after that, they passed down things, because Cain and Abel know they're supposed to worship a particular way. Cain doesn't do that, and he was supposed to know that, and he's counseled to act differently. And then, of course, you have other believers after that who are worshiping God. You have Noah and different things like that. So that they have a particular, there's sacrifice, there's different things that are happening. People are calling on the name of the Lord. So there's enough out there about God and the creation. It's just not maybe written down until Job, Genesis, in a formal way. But no doubt there was oral things being passed down as parents taught their children, and generation after generation. And like you mentioned, I don't know when, but the patriarch, the super long lives and the overlap, right? And how much shared information there would have been. So, So I think that's a safe just assessment to make, that these people had, Abraham had revelation about what he was supposed to do, ethics and who God was. So, all right, any other thoughts before we making some new headway? We're doing pretty good here. Just as a footnote, when I first kind of, I think it was Abner Chow who I really heard this kind of way to think about the friends. This is the hardest hardest part of the book, I think, in my mind. Because you get to the part about God, where God speaks, and it's relatively straightforward. God is like, hey, you're not me, so shut your mouth. It's like, and he just showcases his greatness. And that's pretty, easy to grasp. The beginning of the book is pretty easy to grasp. People focus on chapters 1 and 2. And the very end of the book. But what's hard is, what do we do with these dialogues, and why so much of it? And I think if you can get the basic concept that really God is just putting forward the very best of the best thinkers and their best philosophies to show that they're empty. They cannot answer everything. They only have a portion of what they can observe, but they're not omniscient. They've never been everywhere. They don't know everything. And so they cannot know what the world is about and what God is doing unless God tells us. And so I think that's what the book is really hammering at. You could say a couple R words, right? Revelation. We have to have revelation from God if we're to understand the world. We have to, rightness or righteousness. Like we said, the word righteousness is used more in Job than any other book of the Bible, including Romans. And because God is showing himself that he is right. He is right in everything that he does. And I think I had another R, but I can't remember right now. Redeemer. Yeah, there we go. We have the early kind of setups for Job's hope, and we're going to see in a minute Elihu as well, of what mankind needs, what kind of a redeemer mankind needs. So, all right, let's make some more headway here. Our next point that we want to look at is Elihu. And this is going to be starting in chapter 32. So go there. And this is called Uncommon Clarity from Elihu. Uncommon Clarity from Elihu. So I'm just curious, what do you think about Elihu? What have you heard about Elihu? He's the fourth guy. There's kind of a gap between the three guys, and I'm just curious, before we kind of get into it. This is chapters 32 to 37, by the way. 32 to 37.
Well, I'll tell you, these guys are a lot smarter than I am. Their arguments and just the depth of where they go. And I like some of that stuff you pointed out. Just, you don't think about the ingenuity of that long ago for him to say that the earth is producing fire, from down beneath. And you're just like, wait a minute. We think we discover all this stuff. These guys are in it.
Yeah.
Finding sapphires, diamonds, gold, but, we're seeking wisdom here. It's the argumentative points of today, I think, that people get. I've been listening to a lot of the atheists and their debates on YouTube, and, just the thought process is pretty legitimate, but then you're just going, but it's based on just absolute man's best guess of why there is no God. And it's kind of like this, now they're starting to get to the points of, well, it must be something you've done.
Yeah.
It's you. It's all on you. Because maybe I like the points of, pre and modern and post, and, they get to the point now they're just grasping for straws a little bit, I think. So,
yep, they're desperate.
Yeah, they're just like, hey, my arguments aren't making sense. You've debated them a little bit. Now I'm just going to blame you.
Yeah.
It's got to be something. So, and I think we all feel that a little bit in our own lives. I remember when I was in St. Paul playing, and there's a guy named David Hulse that played. He was with Texas, and he had gotten released, and he was trying to get back to the big league, just trying to get an invite with somebody. And he had about 3 or 4 years in the league, and now he's an independent ball. He's a great Christian guy, but he just wasn't hitting. Couldn't get any hits. And we're playing independent ball. He's like, man, I'm going to go lock myself in my room with my Bible. I got to be doing something. It's got to be on. It's kind of like you point it back on you. Like, hey, I must be suffering something because I'm in sin. And, you know, I think that's what, I mean, it goes all the way back to Job. I mean, these guys are doing the same thing to him. So.
Yep. And, you know, the argument only works well if you really understand that these guys are wicked smart, you know, that they really do know their stuff, but they're just limited. They're finite. And that if you only have a portion of what observationally seems to work in some cases, it's very dangerous to expand that out to every case. Because we know that they're essentially saying, like, you reap what you sow. If you do wrong, God's going to punish you. And so then they start to expand that out, and they're like, I forget which one of them. Maybe it's Zophar. Will say something like, everyone gets it in this life. And Job's like, wait a minute, that's definitely not true. There are plenty of people who are wicked, and they prosper, and then they die, and it doesn't seem like anything happened. And the argument is, well, everyone gets it in the end, but not in this life. God, and so their argument gets it's too simple, and really their system ends up. I mean, this is kind of like spoiler alert, but that system is not the true system of how the world works. The gospel is the true system, right? That God punishes those in the end, but also God provides a way for God to be right, if the book's about God's rightness, but also how can man be right at the same time if man's a sinner? And Job is beginning to help us in categories so that when you get to Romans totally makes sense because God is just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Christ. Because how can God remain just and yet justify people? Well, it's through the gospel. That's the system that works. Okay, Elihu. Let's look at this dude. So people have different views on Elihu. Some think he's just like the friends and he's just kind of repeating what they said. Some really don't like him. Some like him. I want to make a case that Elihu is a good guy. And I think maybe Elihu is the author of Job. Couple reasons for that. He's a young guy, okay? He's young. He is the only one of the friends in chapter 42 who is not mentioned. So in chapter 42, when Job repents, he tells basically Job, God rebukes the three friends, but Elihu isn't mentioned. So that at least gives us some pause to say, maybe Elihu's coming at this from a different angle, and he's not being rebuked by God, so maybe he said something right. He also uniquely gets a genealogy in the beginning when he's introduced in chapter 32. So just look at the beginning of 32. So these three men ceased to answer Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. Then Elihu, the son of Barachel, the Buzite of the family of Ram, burned with anger. And I think this idea is like a righteous indignation. He burned with anger at Job because he justified himself rather than God. He burned with anger. Notice also the rightness idea, the justification. That's related to the term for righteousness. I'm right, and God, not focusing on God's rightness. Verse 3, he burned with anger also at Job's three friends because they had found no answer, although they had declared Job to be in the wrong. Now Elihu had waited to speak to Job because they were older than he. And when Elihu saw that there was no answer in the mouth of these three men, he burned with anger. Okay, so he's younger, right? So, why would he wait? Just think culturally.
Respect your elders.
Exactly, yeah. Respect your elders. That's very culturally appropriate. But what possibly, in this context, would give the right for a young person to speak and be right in contrast to the elders, the older people? What could possibly allow a young person without as many years to be right in contrast to those who've lived longer and know more potentially? Think of the book. What's the book about? What is Job hammering the point of? We need a Bible, right? So what could make you wiser than your elders is revelation, right? Actually, that's what the psalmist says. I'm wiser than my elders. Why? How? He's not being arrogant. He's just saying, those who don't know God and his ways, though they be old, and though they have lots of experience, if they don't have the scriptures that they submit to, then you can be a youth, relatively, and know the truth, submit to the truth, and know more in that regard. And I think that's what we're going to see with Elihu. He kind of seems to represent a prophet of sorts, or maybe some of you even suggested this is kind of like an early paradigm of like a John the Baptist to Jesus, right? Because Elihu will speak, and he prepares the way for God's speech. He's like the forerunner for God to speak. He prepares Job to meet his God. He's also more compassionate in his counsel. In what he says, chapter 33, verse 6, "Behold, I am towards God as you are. I too was pinched off from a piece of clay. Behold, no fear of me need terrify you. My pressure will not be heavy upon you." Compared to the friends, so-called friends, Elihu has a much better tact as he addresses Job. But he comes to correct Job for going too far. So he doesn't agree with the friends, though he will reiterate some of their arguments to make his point. He doesn't quite agree with their reasoning, though he does see that Job has become somewhat self-righteous, and so he's going to correct him on that. Now, we don't have time to get into all the weeds with him, but go to chapter... In essence, Elihu begins in chapter 32, verse 6, and he says, "I am young in years, and you are aged. Therefore I was timid and afraid to declare my opinion to you. I said, let days speak, and many years teach wisdom. But it is the Spirit in man, the breath of the Almighty, that makes him understand." In other words, wisdom. The breath of God, the word of God. That makes him understand. "It is not the old who are wise, nor the aged who understand what is right. Therefore I say, listen to me. Let me also declare my opinion." And he ends up saying like, hey, I waited, and I'm just like burning inside. I'm like like wineskin that needs to be opened up and let out. I'm going to burst. In verse 14, he says, "He has not directed his words against me, and I will not answer him with your speeches." I think this is a kind of a different approach than the friends have given. So if we jump to chapter 33, and I want to focus on one section in particular that is really fascinating, because Elihu seems to mirror some of the same longings that Job has for a redeemer. And this is like a really cool, when you think of like passages where you can really see hope for Messiah explicitly, this is kind of an overlooked one, but a really profound one. So chapter 33, probably starting around, verse 23. I'll pick it up there. Listen to how he says this. Verse 33:23. Elihu says to Job, "If there be for him an angel," or the idea is like a messenger, "a mediator, one of the 1,000." In other words, like 1 out of 1,000. It's a very remote possibility. What would this person do? To declare to man what is right for him. And he is merciful to him and says, "Deliver him from going down into the pit. I have found a ransom. Let his flesh become fresh with youth. Let him return to the days of his youthful vigor." Then man prays to God, and he accepts him. He sees his face with a shout of joy, and he restores to man his righteousness. And then verse 27, he sings before men and says, "I sinned and perverted what was right, and it was not repaid to me. He has redeemed my soul from going down into the pit, and my life shall look upon the light." Now, obviously this is kind of some like ancient language, but what is he getting at here? It's like he starts to reason with Job and say, okay, Job, if there was a mediator, this kind of figure that you're talking about, a messenger, it's such a remote possibility. It's like 1 in 1,000. It's so rare. It's so unique. It's so difficult to find. It's one of a kind. But that's the gospel, right? It's like, what are the chances that we would have a mediator who could do all this for us? And notice some of the things he mentions. Redemption, verse 24. He is merciful to him and says, "Deliver him from going down into the pit." He talks about resurrection. Verse 25, let his flesh become fresh with youth. Let him return to the days of his youthful vigor. Reconciliation, verse 26, that man prays to God and he accepts him. Rejoicing, he sees his face with a shout of joy, and he restores to man his righteousness. There's righteousness even. So you see all these things kind of coming together as Elihu joins in on this. And so it's just an incredible passage as Elihu prepares Job to hear from God, and he brings together all the little strings and strands that Job was hoping for into one passage. And it's really cool. It's a passage worthy of more study to really mine its depths. So I think that's really cool. And I love the 1 in 1,000 thing. He's like, Job, come on, man. Just like
1 in 1,000.
1 in 1,000. Yeah, but
Consider.
it happened. Right? It happened.
1 in 1,000 is a lot better chance than what really happened.
Yeah, exactly. So that's one of my favorite statements in the book of Job. 1 in 1,000. So then Elihu will bring up this idea, an example of a thunderstorm. Really at like 36 and 37. And here's the argument essentially that he's getting at. Job, look at how chaotic a thunderstorm is. Can you tell me when a thunderstorm begins, Job? Is essentially his question. And like chapter 36, verse 27, verse 26 rather. Behold, God is great, and we know him not. The number of his years is unsearchable, for he draws up the drops of water. They distill his mist in rain, which the skies pour down and drop on mankind abundantly. Whoa, what an understanding of the system, before, at such an early stage. And he's saying, hey, Job, do you even know how this all begins? It begins with evaporation. And then what about the end of it? What are the purposes that God has for a thunderstorm? Verse 30 and 31, behold, he scatters his lightning about him and covers the roots of the sea. For by these he judges peoples. He gives food in abundance. He covers his hands with the lightning and commands it to strike the mark. Its crashing declares his presence. The cattle also declare that he rises. So in other words, he's saying, I've got all these purposes. God has all these purposes for thunderstorms. Maybe he wants to stop traffic because he wants this person to get to that place too soon. Maybe he's wanting to water the crops. Maybe he's wanting to cause a fire over here, which is going to do something later. He has so many purposes. Do you know what God is doing in a thunderstorm? What is its goal? It's multifaceted. He's doing all kinds of things through this one event we call a thunderstorm. And what else do we know about thunderstorms? Well, they're out of control. They seem out of control, but they're not out of control. They're in perfect control, in God's control. And so this becomes a good kind of way to think about evil and suffering in the world. That Job, do you know, the thunderstorm? And do you know what its purposes are? Well, if you can't even know that, how do you know what God's purposes are in the problem of evil? And what God's goals are in using that which seems to be chaotic. This thunderstorm we call life is very much in God's control, and he has purposes for it. And so God knows how to handle all these things. God is righteous. You can't accuse him because you don't know enough, Job. So that's essentially what he does to prepare him for God. And let's just kind of race to the end here, and then we can do some questions. The next point is unforgettable confrontation from God. Unforgettable confrontation from God. Chapters 38 to the beginning of 42. And in some ways we can kind of summarize this. I think you're probably more familiar with this section. And which you have, I'll pull up a note I have here. You have two discourses from God. This first one, God is showing that he is right. And really, in chapter 38, God shows that he knows better. And you have this kind of walkthrough, like all these questions that Job gets asked. What, how, where, why, when? And Job doesn't know the answer to any of these questions. But he does know the answer to who does all these things and who knows all these things. He knows that it's God, but he doesn't know the answer to these things. So God just begins to question him. Verse 1 of chapter 38. Then Yahweh answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge?" Once again, we're back to Revelation. "Dress for action like a man. I'll question you and make it known to me, and you make it known to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding. Who determines its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? Or when were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy." That's probably talking about the angels' witness of creation, or some of it. And he just goes on and on here. Who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out of the womb? And he just goes on and on here, and and just questioning Job. Job, you don't know. You don't know any of these things. You can't question me. God then shows that he knows better. And chapter 39. And God can control things better as well. And this is where we see kind of the second section. And he uses the example of these two beasts. And everyone wondering, like, who are these beasts? You have the behemoth and the Leviathan. And God brings these two up. And they're, I think best, I mean, just to cut to the chase, I think they're probably like dinosaurs of some kind, right? Because I don't think it's helpful. People try and look for animals today that match these, but they don't fit. So these some kind of creatures that he points to say, can you control the behemoth? This massive, like, it's like a super cow, because he actually uses the same word that was used earlier for cows, but it's like a mega cow. It's like a huge creature. Can you tame it? No. How about the Leviathan? Can you control that? And it's like the Leviathan, or the serpent, the serpentine creature. It's like Satan's mascot, some have pointed out. And it's like, you can't do this. You try and capture it, but it won't work. So Job can't control these things that are creatures, unwieldy. And so why does he think he can understand God's ways? It has power to understand these. So one of the interesting things, let's see, I took a note down here. I wanted to make sure I said, see if I have it. No, I don't. I can't find it. I know, I'd love to read these passages, but I can't find my note. But so he brings these two up just to show, Job, you don't have the power over this. Verse 41, or chapter 41, verse 11, I think is key. He says, who was first given to me that I should repay him? Whatever is under the whole heaven is mine. So he rebukes Job, and then this leads us to our final section. Let me just make one more note about this section. It's great. This is like passages like Isaiah 40 to 45, Isaiah 6. This section are great passages to use and meditate on for just who God is, just a big God view. And so Job ends up admitting that God is right and that he has done it better than he could. God is vindicated in both heaven and earth. And God is right, we might say, in a world gone wrong. He has purposes even if man cannot see it. And so we see finally this last section called Unmerited Consolation. Unmerited Consolation, chapter 42. And essentially here you see the repentance of Job, the rebuke of the friends, the restoration of Job's things. And so we see there, verse 7, after Yahweh had spoken these words to Job, Yahweh said to Eliphaz the Temanite, my anger burns against you and against your two friends. So once again, notice Eliphaz, the first friend, and the two friends, that's the three guys he's being rebuked, but not Elihu. For you have not spoken to me what is right, as my servant Job has. Now, therefore, take 7 bulls and 7 rams and go to my servant Job and offer up a burnt offering for yourselves. and my servant Job shall pray for you. For I will accept his prayer, not to deal with you according to your folly. Notice he calls their wisdom folly. This is like Paul in 1 Corinthians 1. The wisdom of the world is folly. For you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. And this is really important, as a lesson for us. Like, if you're going to talk and represent God, you better speak what is right about God. Verse 9, so Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite went and did what Yahweh had told them, and Yahweh accepted Job's prayer. And Yahweh restored the fortunes of Job when he had prayed for his friends, and Yahweh gave Job twice as much as he had before. Then came to him all his brothers and sisters, and all who had known him before, and ate bread with him in his house. And they showed him sympathy and comforted him for all the evil that Yahweh had brought upon him. And each of them gave him a piece of money and a ring of gold. And Yahweh blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning. He had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, 1,000 female donkeys. He had also 7 sons and 3 daughters. And he called the name of the first daughter Jemimah, and the name of the second Keziah, and the name of the third Kereth Happuth. And in all the land there were no women so beautiful as Job's daughters, and their father gave them an inheritance among their brothers. And after this, Job lived for 140 years and saw his sons and his sons' sons for 4 generations. And Job died an old man and full of years. In the end, Job dies. That's how the book ends. Job doesn't know. He's not told what happens to him. But as one person pointed out, Job got all that he hoped for when he died. He realized what the plan was. He knew God. He died, and he entered into the presence of God, and he realized, oh, wow, this is the plan. It's glorious. And so the book of Job helps us, see God is right in heaven, but God is also right on earth. He's proved to be right. We don't know what God is doing necessarily in our personal suffering, but we do know who is in control behind it all. And so we might say that God is able to be both just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Christ. And go to 1 Corinthians chapter 1 for a second, and I think this is a helpful way to wrap up. Of course, James mentions the perseverance of Job, so there's a mention of Job in the New Testament, and the purpose of God in his life. But this, I think, brings together some of the themes in Job pretty well. 1 Corinthians 1, verse 30. And it talks about verse 27 is apropos as well. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God. And because of him, you are in Christ Jesus, who became to us, listen to this, wisdom from God, righteousness and sanctification and redemption, so that, as it is written, let the one who boasts boast in the Lord. I love that. Jesus became to us wisdom. That's what they needed. Job was saying, chapter 28, you need wisdom from God to really know what's happening. You need righteousness from God and redemption from God. And it all comes in the Redeemer, the Lord Jesus Christ. So Job is one who suffers unjustly, in the sense of not committing sin as a result, to set up for the one who will have the ultimate unjust suffering, the Lord Jesus. So Job becomes the prequel to the Bible, and you finish the book of Job, and you get Genesis, and you learn, where did sin come from? And how is God going to defeat it? Genesis 3:15. The seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. And we get revelation. And so I think it makes us cherish the rest of the Bible that much more. We say, wow, we need this whole book to know all that God is doing and has plans for in the world. So maybe we should have started with the book of Job in our survey of the Bible, but we just are not doing that order. But anyway, that's what I got. Hopefully a good reading strategy for you as you try and